Welcome to the best place where you can learn how to create a tracking plan. And the emphasis in this whole series is not really like creating the tracking plan, but actually looking into the decisions that you have to make when you create a tracking plan. Creating a tracking plan is super simple. In the simplest version, I go over and say, okay, I want to track when someone clicks here, I want to track when someone clicks there, I want to click when someone clicks in the navigation, whatever. Everyone can do this. It's not really hard. The hard part is actually to find the right kind of level of events that actually provide some insights into product, how product is used, not how product is clicked, how product is used, and how much business value is actually coming out of the whole setup. And so this is what we are focusing on here today. In this series, I pick a well-known startup product and I think about how I would create a tracking plan for it. Today we pick Superhuman. We won't go into if Superhuman is a useful product at all. I personally use it for quite a while and I quite just like the client, how it works, how I work. Therefore, for me at least, it's a useful product. So, but it's a really good case to think about, okay, how a tracking plan could look like, because it's just an email client, so it's not that hard, but it has some interesting aspects. And I have one thing which is really interesting to look into, because this really explains the concept of we have to focus on the product value or on the business value in comparison to just track where people are clicking. So before we do this, let me explain a little bit how the whole things work. I have written a book which is called the Analytics Implementation Workbook, where I describe this whole thing. I describe how to actually come up with a really good event data design that, or AKA a tracking plan, that really helps you to understand how people are actually using the product and not just clicking the product. And then also like how this translates into understanding customer journeys and understanding business value. I use this book, so when you buy the book, you get two PDFs. So one is like the whole big PDF that you can just read. The other one, you get a mini PDF. And I use this mini PDF in a Claude project, as you can see here, as context. And I just found out that it works really, really well to create a first draft of a tracking plan. And it comes quite close how I would have created a first draft of a tracking plan. And so this is the procedure how I create tracking plans. So I already created this kind of setup, how I have worked with Claude to create a first draft version of my tracking plan. And so I want to walk you through everything that I did here so that you can learn from it. It's not just how you would use a Gen AI model to create a tracking plan. All the things that we put in here are all parts of my usual process, how I would create a tracking plan from scratch without any kind of AI help. AI just makes a shortcut for me to create the first draft, but the whole process is still the same. Let's have a quick look into it. So what I start with, I mean, this is not a complicated prompt, but the essential thing is here. I outline all the different kind of use cases that I see as essential within the product. And this is something that you can do either because you know the product already pretty well, or you can sit together with the product team, marketing team, customer success team, and you have to identify the core use cases or core jobs to be done that people actually do within your product. Because we are not so much interested where people can click. This is not really hard work. The little bit more hard work is really like to define. So something like this. Okay, users can create an account, add one or more email accounts to Superhuman. Then users can receive emails, read them, answer them, or mark them as done, which will remove them from the inbox. Users can schedule emails and then they can move emails from the inbox with a reminder to reappear at a different time. So these are all essential features within Superhuman. And you can already see, for example, I also wrote explicitly here, users are motivated to try to empty their complete inbox. Maybe I should have made it even clearer. Superhuman, at least when it got started, their big claim was like, it helps you to get to zero inbox or inbox zero. A lot of their functionality and features are basically built for it. The thing that I can easily mark emails as done is to empty my inbox. The thing that I can snooze emails and get them back maybe next week or so on is just to get an empty inbox. Because some things usually I have to keep in my inbox because I haven't received an answer yet. I don't know what I should write them. The snooze functionality is an important asset here to really say, okay, please bring it back next week because maybe then I have a solution about it. This is what I'm doing here. I'm outlining the core functions that I see that basically defines Superhuman. Obviously, they have extended their product a lot. I would say in the last 6 months, they moved the product more into a team product, more sales capabilities. This would be a next version of it. But let's say here, I'm focusing really like on the core. And if you create the first tracking plan for your product, I advise you to do the same. So don't go crazy with including all the, let's say, broader features. So you always have a core in the middle. These are the core product functions. Focus on this first and then expand and see, okay, what kind of other features might be important or not. With that given, Claude created me a first tracking plan, and we can see it here. And so with this tracking plan, there were some interesting points where when I would have created the first draft, this could have been a first draft that I have created by hand. But there are some parts where I have to make some decisions. We have 3 different layers. We have the product layer, we have the customer layer, and we have the interaction layer. In the product layer, we look into the core product activities that are defining the product. Basically the representation of all the use cases that we have written over there. This is why it's called the double 3-layer framework. We have the product layer, and then within the product layer we look into entities, activities, and properties, which are defining, in the end, the events that we're tracking there. When we look into the entities, so what Claude is proposing, like we have account, totally makes sense. I need to create an account in Superhuman. Then we have email accounts. These are the different email accounts that I connect in my account to receive my emails. Then we have email, which is basically the centerpiece of this product, the most essential entity that we have. Without this entity, Superhuman would not be Superhuman. And then we have folders, and then we have search. The last 2 are interesting cases where we can discuss how important are these entities actually for my tracking plan. For example, folder is definitely, it's a product feature, but is it really a core product feature? I would say if we were to look at Outlook or other email clients that basically come with the paradigm that you usually organize your emails in some specific ways, or there are even like some email clients who help you with some smart folders and so on to move things automatically in different kind of folders. In that case, I would definitely include folder here as a core entity because it really drives the user experience. In Superhumans, folders are there, so you can create a folder, you can move things into a folder, but it's more like a secondary item. It's not a first-class citizen in the user experience, because the user experience is like, okay, you just walk through your emails and you just move them out, that in the end, like, you just focus on the emails that are present, that you really have to work on. So yeah, you have some history, but for this, for example, in Superhuman, the search is the main thing. So Superhuman has a really good search experience, so they optimize it a lot. So for them, folders are not that important. So therefore, I would exclude folders here. Next, do we need search? So we will discuss this in a second. How many activities do we actually have within the search entity? And I can tell you, we will not have much. We will just have one activity. Usually, if I find an entity with just one activity, it's a clear indicator for me that maybe this is not a good candidate for an entity when we just have one activity. But here in this case, I make a different decision. As I said, search is an important part of the Superhuman product promise or product experience. Therefore, I want to have it as its own entity because like it's just too important for us to put it somewhere else. So this is the first decisions that I usually do. So do these entity make sense and can I start building on that? Because like these are my foundational building blocks and then I start to build everything around it. The next thing what we do is we define the activities within an entity. And I'm always trying to have some kind of life cycle within an entity that makes it easy to design the right kind of activities, and also like it makes it easy for me to check if I have covered all the activities. So how does the life cycle of an account look like? We have created, updated, subscription changed, and deleted. Definitely looks like a good life cycle. I would just do 2 things here. Updated is something, if you watch other videos where we discuss these kind of tracking plans, it's like updated always comes up and it's always the big question, do we keep it or not? Does it provide us value if we know that account has been updated? It only provides us value when important things have been updated. In this case, there are no important things that I can think about that you would update in a Superhuman account. Therefore, I would get rid of the updated activity because it doesn't really provide us any kind of value. Subscriptions changed, a different topic. I can handle, again, it's the question between entity, which kind of entities do I need? I want to have subscription as its own entity. This is my own design principle. You can do it differently, but I always like to have subscription as its own entity because it represents revenue. Revenue is important for every kind of business, therefore I want to have it standalone there. It's also the case that often this data comes from a different data source. All the subscription data usually comes from Stripe or other kind of providers. Therefore, to have it in this own entity can also make sense. But for me, the major argument is like, it's revenue, it has to be there, it's important, therefore its own entity. But you could also put it in here if you think, okay, it's actually not important for us, or actually I don't want to introduce another subscription entity. So you could have it in here, or you could just have it as a property. We could have an account subscription plan as property, and there we basically have the information. If it is for you just important to know if this account is on a subscription, or if this account is a free account, or if this account is a trial account, then the property is just the only place where you can add something like this. So again, it really comes down what kind of questions, what kind of use cases you want to answer right now in your analyze. For example, the own subscription entity could be something for the future. Because right now you're not ready yet to combine these two data sets, like the behavioral data that you track for the product and then the subscription data that you get from Stripe. Obviously, to analyze it properly, you have to combine it. In an ideal world, it's great because like you can always see how specific behavior looks like, and then you can see how does it impact subscription status. Obviously, I want to have this, but sometimes there's no bandwidth to basically implement everything like this. Then get rid of the subscription entity because it doesn't really help you a lot. Okay. Account properties. The only thing that I would change here is like we always have this account created at. It's not totally useless, but you cannot really do a lot with this in an analytics tool. So in an analytics tool, it's more helpful to create a property that would be like account created days. Then it basically you calculate how many days have been passed until this account have been created. Or even better, you would cluster it and you would say account created days. And then, for example, like, I don't know, bigger than 500, then 400 to 500, 200 to 400, 100 to 200, and so on. We create different kind of clusters. Clusters work really great in analysis because like it enables you to create breakdowns, and the breakdowns then don't have 400 groups. 400 groups you cannot really analyze. Creating clusters is definitely something which is super helpful. Again, I would always track both information because the clusters can change. And since we are already preparing the clusters before we send it into the analytics tool, we cannot really change this. Some analytics tools have the possibilities to take the raw values, like we have the single days until the account has been created, and then create the clusters in the analytics tools. This is obviously the best way to do it, but sometimes you don't have the possibility to do it, so you prepared before. Okay, so when we see here the email account activities, so we have connected, yes, very important. We have synced. I think, at least from my experience working with email accounts, there's rarely an issue that the emails are not getting synced. It looks like this problem has been solved. A lot of problems in our daily work life haven't been solved with tech yet, but syncing emails into an email client looks like a solved problem. We don't really have to track it unless it becomes a problem again, but it doesn't really give us a lot of value. Disconnected gives us value. I want to add another activity that is not in here, and this is an interesting one. I think this is the most interesting one about the whole series. So I want to introduce an activity which is called Inbox Zero Achieved. The reason for this is that the whole promise of Superhuman is to get you to Inbox Zero. At least it was when they got started. I think now it basically got a little bit pushed aside with other things. But when they got started, the most important thing is like, okay, this tool is the perfect one to really get you to inbox zero. And they added a lot of interesting stuff to achieve that. So for example, they are really good with keyword shortcuts. We get to keyword shortcuts at the end of the video, how we track this. But everything that I can easily mark my emails as done, or that I can snooze emails, or everything else, they are all built in to help me to get my inbox to zero. So if it's so important for us, I want to have an explicit event that is fired once the inbox is on zero, because I can then use this to track my customer activities. My customer activities will be built around a lot about inbox zero. You will see this in a second when we get to the point. Therefore, I want to add another activity here, which is called inbox zero. Okay, properties. Again, here we have account status, connected an error. I think this is totally sufficient. And then also like with the error, we already have covered that if it runs into some kind of issues, we can still see this in the data. I would remove syncing because I think syncing is something that happens for some seconds and then it's gone. It doesn't really give us a lot of interesting things. Okay, let's go on to email. We can receive an email, we can read an email. This is interesting. This really comes down to how you implement that. In Superhuman's case, when you open up the application, you have a list of all your emails. So you see the subject. I think you see a little bit of the part of the email body as well, and you obviously see where the email is coming from. Usually the way you work with the tool is you go through this list and you make a decision about, can I get it away? Or you archive it? Do I read it? Do I open it? Or do I snooze it or do something else? But you explicitly say, okay, I want to read this, I want to open this. And this would be the part where I would fire this one. Because then it's really interesting to analyze how people are actually working with the email. Do they immediately decide to archive this? This could be an interesting metric to really see how much percentage of emails are never read, but immediately are marked as done and therefore archived. This can give you a good indication about how much spam people get or how much unimportant things people get. So read here, let's say email account, email read is a really important event when we track it in the right way. If we would just have tracked when, let's say this is the tricky thing with other clients where you have, let's say, where you have these 3 pane windows where you have first the folders, then you have the list of emails, and on the right you immediately have the email preview. When you work through your emails, you immediately see them in the preview, and so therefore the red event doesn't really make sense. So in that case, I wouldn't implement it. In Superhuman, it's more really like an intentional thing that the user does, and therefore it definitely deserves its own event or activity. So therefore we will keep it. Replied, definitely super important because it shows, okay, we are interacting with the tool. In the end, it's a small success moment. I mean, depending on the reply, but let's say, okay, from an email perspective, it's successful. Archived, I would rename to done because done represents more how Superhuman called these things, but let's say technically it's the same thing. I would just change the naming. Schedule is interesting. So scheduled here applies for if I write a reply, is the reply scheduled or is it sent immediately? In that case, I would get rid of the activity because the activity by itself is not strong enough to be an activity, and because I can also have it just as a property that I can send with a, let's say, email replied event. Then I can just immediately see, okay, how many replies have been sent immediately and how many replies have been scheduled. This gives me the information I'm interested in. I don't need an additional event for this. So I would get rid of this activity because, yeah, we actually don't really need it. Snooze, by the other hand, is something which is really important for us because, like, again, it contributes to the zero inbox paradigm. And so therefore, we really want to know how many messages or how many emails have been snoozed to come up later. The interesting thing is, for example, if we then also track received again when the email comes back after being snoozed. I guess it would make sense, and then we would have in the properties, like if it was a snoozed email or if it was just a new email coming in. Therefore, we can even analyze, okay, how many emails come back a day. Let's say 95% are new emails, 5% are snoozed emails that are just coming back. And then we can also analyze this if they get re-snoozed, which is an interesting word, again, so that we can analyze what's happening there. This is all covered with that. Moved. This might be totally enough. As I said, I would get rid of the folder entity, but as a first implementation, I would keep the email moved event or the moved activity, because this already tells us like how active a user is and is using folders. With that, we can already see at least the final result when people are moving a lot into folders. When we see this a lot, this might be an indicator that we should get the folder entity back into the mix and provide it as an analyst insight. But here we basically make a first analysis with it. Then the properties, as I already said, like email status. Here, when we receive the email, they are all mostly unread. But for example, we could integrate here if they are new, and then we could also integrate that they are snoozed. Here, email type, not really 100% sure if this really makes sense. Email type could be something that, and I think that Superhuman does kind of this. The category of an email, for example, could be a candidate here. So that in the end, we are looking into, so like, Superhuman is classifying emails based on if they're really important for us, if they are just newsletters and so on. Something like this could be in here. This could be super interesting to really understand how an email inbox or how email activity actually looks like. It's also interesting to understand then how email activity looks like, because people usually, they don't interact with newsletters just if they're really interested in. To really have a possibility to group into important emails or non-important emails. So this, for example, could be a type, if you just want to have two types that we can work with. Email size, I would get rid of it because like size in bytes doesn't really... It was important years ago where you had limited, let's say, inbox storage space, but since we don't have this anymore, it's not really important for us. Email thread size, it's a really interesting idea. I definitely like that. At least a first possibility to analyze how many email threads are actually happening within the account. Snooze duration is also super interesting to really see how people are using this kind of feature. It also gives us some feedback about product development, let's say, because if we have some presets, we can see how these presets are used. Okay, folder we get rid of. In search, Claude proposed for 3 activities here. It has AI search performed and results viewed. I would get rid of AI search performed because we can just have performed and we can just provide which kind of search as the property. It's much better to do it that way because this doesn't really give us a lot more value, and we can still surface it really easily to really understand how many people are actually using the new AI search. Results viewed I will also get rid of because at least in Superhuman, there's not a breaking point between I perform a search and I see the results. This happens immediately, and so I don't really get a lot of value to track results viewed because the numbers would even be the same as performed. I would get rid of this as well. As I said before, this leaves us with one activity, often at least one small red flag to say, hey, is this really an entity? As I said before, search is so important for us, so we keep it as an entity. Okay, when we look into the properties, the search query I would never put in as a property because it generates value that has no value for us from an analysis perspective. They have value, obviously, for the users. It's also an entry door for any kind of PII information. When someone, for example, search for an email address and then we pop in the email address here. Get rid of these things. Whenever you have a property that can have some user-generated stuff in there, it's usually a useless property because you cannot do any kind of analysis on top. So you will have a random list of any kind of terms in there, and it doesn't really provide any kind of value. Search type, as I already said, this is interesting for us to really have a distinction between regular and AI. Number of results, it's interesting for an e-commerce, but for a email inbox, not really. The only thing what we could do is like we could have a property like 0 results. So how often do people run into no results searches? But again, we're talking about email, we're not talking about e-commerce. It doesn't really have such big relevance. Search time, again, if we really think, okay, so I know that speed is an important thing within Superhuman. This could be an important property to track, because like we can at least correlate the search time to other user experience data that we collect. Search filter use is a nice way if you really want to track if filters are used, but you don't want to go the full way at like which filters have been used with which kind of values. So this can immediately create a quite extensive property setup. If you just want to get started, this is a great way to do it, because this just tells you true or false. And then in the end, you can see, okay, when you have a lot of searches with filters and you want to get more details in this, maybe you can then add 2 or 3 more properties that at least tell you which kind of filters have been used. Okay, perfect. Let's move on to the customer layer. The customer layer sits on top of the product layer. As I said, it's usually built by using the product activities, let's say in a different kind of context. So for example, we can have a customer activity, which is first value experience. And so this can be constructed by someone has connected an email account and the first email processed, like read, archive, or replied, and then the first inbox 0 achieved. Here we combine these. In the end, we create a rule set to define this kind of activity. This can be done in most of the advanced analytics tools like Amplitude, Mixpanel, or Posttalk, so that in the end, like you can create a constructed activity or event on top of rule sets of other events. We usually do this by creating a segment or cohort. But this is something for a different kind of video, or you can just check out my YouTube channel. I have at least one video in there how I describe how to do this. Again, value repeated, we do the same thing. Here, I would say this is more like an or combination. Either I maintain my inbox 0, or I process so that many emails per day, or I use advanced features regularly, at least like one time a week. In this customer activities, you often also have a time period, a moving time window in there. For example, value repeated. This, for example, first value experience, I could time box to the first 7 days. If in the first 7 days the users don't get there, I can say, okay, we definitely have failed to provide the first value, because most of the users will just have stopped using the product by now. We can time box this with 7 days. We can do the same thing here. We can also look here on value repeated on a time box of a moving window of 7 days. We can say, okay, if in the last 7 days someone has did this, we can say, okay, they definitely got a repeated value from it. And then we can use the same thing here for the at risk, where we can say, okay, we saw in the past, let's say in the last 200 days, they had at least 3 weeks with added value where they had the valuable experience from here. But now in the last 2 weeks, we cannot see this behavior anymore. With this, we flag them as at risk because we see that the pattern has changed. They might be just on holiday, so it's super fine. So they can stay potentially in the at risk group for some time. But at some point, if they keep staying in there, we might even introduce another customer activity, which would be a dormant user. A dormant user is really someone who has been active a long while ago, but we couldn't see any activity in the last 6 to 8 weeks. And so there we say, okay, we might have lost this user. This becomes really interesting when you have the subscription data, because when you can see that someone is dormant or at risk, but they still have a subscription, then your subscription definitely is at risk too, at least when they really achieve or when they really got to the dormant state, because at some point they would cancel the subscription. Pretty clear. Okay, final thing about the interaction layer. The interaction layer actually sits under the product layer. And in the interaction layer, we put all the things where we want to track how people are interacting. These are the product clicks that I mentioned before, which can be interesting in very specific scenarios. Let's take the keyboard shortcut used. I will track this with this kind of event. And I would track it because the keyboard shortcuts is definitely an important feature in Superhuman. But it's not as important or not as standalone that I would add it as a product event in the product layer, because I would not introduce an own entity for it. I would not introduce own activities for it, because it's not really telling us something which kind of use cases are actually people doing in the product. It's more like it's a helper for a specific group of users who work a lot with keyboard shortcut. I use them a lot. I might still want to know how often do people use keyboard shortcuts and which kind of keyboard shortcuts are used quite often. Because at some point, from a product perspective, I want to make a decision if, for example, we can get rid of some keyboard shortcuts. If some, let's say, maybe we want to make some keyboard shortcuts more prominent. Maybe someone is analyzing how to create an onboarding sequence, and so they have to make a decision which three keyboard shortcuts they actually should feature, and this is something where this now can really help. If we just have this one event keyboard shortcut used, then we can just analyze this. But we don't really create too much noise with all the other events because we just have this. Therefore, it really stands alone. View changed, and it's something which I would not really be sure if we really would need it, but it could be added here as well. Usually in the interaction layer, I often just have something like element clicked because I can add all the context in the properties. Element click then is really good if someone from the UX team really wants to know, okay, look, we have all these different kind of options when I'm writing my email or when I'm highlighting some text. Which of these options are people actually using the most? This is a question that comes up 2 times a year, has not really significant product experience importance. It's just important for this one UX designer. We still want to track it, but we don't want to track it in a way that it really becomes important and prominent in all the different kind of analysis. And therefore, we just put everything under element click. We can still answer the questions without creating this tracking plan with all the crazy interaction events that actually no one never checks again. Interaction layer is kind of a catch-all to really get all these click events or click-based events. They often can also even be implemented in an automatic way. So for example, if you have a component-based application, so for example, you have a icon button component, there the developers can just add an element clicked event there, and like with all the properties as we have defined, every time they use a new icon button somewhere, it's automatically tracked in that way, and they don't really have to take care of an implementation of it. As I explained, so I made some reductions, usually like it's always reductions. So my first draft is always broader, and then I reduce it to be the core. And then in the end, like with all this, here's my whole feedback that I provided. We can then get much more reduced one where we just have this kind of entities now. Again, subscription questionable if you can really cover it or not. But everything else is now really reduced to the core. And now it can bring into the implementation phase. The next steps, and this is like, you can check out the links. So if you have watched the videos until now, so you can find different kind of links in the description. First, you find a link to the book if you want to get it as well, if you want to create the tracking plans with the book, so you can find it in there. Then you find a link to a Miro board where you can find all these tracking designs here, and also like all the tracking designs from this series. Then you can find a link to the blog post where I go into much more details about the different kind of decisions. It also has all the other links as well. And you find a link to a GitHub repository where you will find all the JSON schemas for all the events that I have described here. That's a very nerdy topic, but if you, for example, work with event data validation on event data pipeline, this JSON schemas is really useful. And so if you want to learn a little bit more, also like I have some videos on my channel to learn more about very advanced way to collect validated data. Okay, so this is the whole thing that you can get. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you want to watch more videos. We have 17 videos to go. I will do 17 videos of this kind of type for different kind of tools. Like the video if you liked it, and see you in the next video.